The wind carried the scent of sage and sorrow across the Wyoming territory as Martha Caldwell stood in the doorway of her weathered cabin, clutching a small burlap sack of salt against her chest. The year was 1887, and the weight of 3 winters without her husband Samuel pressed down on her shoulders like the heavy snows that had claimed him in that avalanche up near Devil's Canyon. She'd learned to carry on as frontier women do, but lately the loneliness had been creeping in through the cracks of her resolve like the persistent Wyoming wind through the gaps in her cabin walls. Old Elena Vasquez had visited that morning, her weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee as she shared the wisdom her grandmother had carried from Mexico to this harsh land. "Mija," she had said, her voice soft as worn leather, "there are places in every home where the salt must go if you want the doors to open again, not just the wooden doors but the doors of the heart, the doors of hope, the doors that lead to tomorrow." Martha had listened with the skepticism of a woman who'd learned that survival depended on practical things like preserved meat, clean water and a good rifle. But as Elena spoke, something in her words resonated with the ache Martha carried in her chest. The feeling that she'd been locked away from life itself ever since Samuel's body had been found beneath that crushing wall of snow and stone. The first place Elena had mentioned was the threshold, right there where you step from the outside world into your sanctuary, Elena had explained, pointing toward Martha's front door. You sprinkle the salt there and you ask for protection from the things that would harm your spirit. Not just the wolves and the bitter cold, but the wolves of despair that prowl around a grieving heart. Martha walked to her front door now, the rough wooden planks creaking under her feet. She'd swept this threshold 1,000 times, worn it smooth with her daily passage between the harsh world outside and the memories that lived within these walls. She opened the small sack and let a thin stream of salt fall across the doorway, watching as the white crystals caught the afternoon light. As she did, she thought of Samuel, how he used to pause here every evening, stamping the dust from his boots and calling out, "Martha, my love, I'm home," in that deep voice that had made her feel like the luckiest woman in the territory. The salt seemed to shimmer for a moment, and Martha felt something shift inside her chest, as if a door that had been sealed tight was beginning to crack open just enough to let in a sliver of light. She hadn't realized how completely she'd shut herself off from the possibility of joy, how she'd been living like a ghost in her own life, going through the motions of existence without really inhabiting her days. The second place Elena had mentioned was the heart of the home, she'd said, where warmth begins and spreads to every corner. You put salt on the hearth and you invite back the warmth not just of fire but of human connection, of love that doesn't die even when the body does. Martha knelt beside the stone fireplace that Samuel had built with his own hands, laying each rock with the careful attention of a man who knew his wife would spend countless hours here, cooking their meals, warming their home, tending the flames that kept the darkness at bay. She could almost see him there, his broad shoulders bent over his work, his hands already scarred from a lifetime of coaxing life from reluctant life. He'd proposed to her right here on one knee on these very stones, the firelight dancing in his eyes as he promised her a life of adventure and devotion. She sprinkled salt along the hearth's edge, and as she did, the memories didn't bring the usual stab of pain. Instead, they brought warmth, the recognition that the love they'd shared was still here, still real, still part of who she was. The salt seemed to catch the light from the banked coals, and Martha felt her heart remembering what it was like to be truly alive, connected to something larger than her own sorrow. Elena's voice echoed in her memory as she moved to the third place, the kitchen table, where we break bread, where we share our days, where we sit across from each other and remember that we are not alone in this world. Salt there opens the door to community, to the reminder that there are others who care about our story. The kitchen table bore the scars of 3 years of solitary meals, of plates set for one, of conversations held only with the wind and the mice that skittered in the wall. Martha had grown accustomed to the silence, had almost convinced herself that she preferred it to the complications of human company. But as she scattered salt across the worn wooden surface, she remembered the neighbors who had stopped by in those first weeks after Samuel's death, bringing food and condolences and offers of help. She'd turned them away, one by one, until they'd stopped coming altogether. The memory brought a flush of shame to her cheeks. Mrs. Henderson from the next homestead over had lost her own husband to typhoid just 2 years before Samuel died, and she'd tried to reach out to offer the companionship of shared grief. But Martha had been too raw, too angry, too convinced that her pain was too large and too unique to be understood by anyone else. Now, as the salt glittered on the table's surface, she realized how much wisdom and comfort she might have found in that offered friendship. The fourth place was the windowsill, the place where light enters and where we look out toward the horizon. Salt on the windowsill, Elena had said, opens the door to possibility, to the future that's waiting for you to notice it. It reminds you that the world is still turning, still beautiful, still full of sunrise and sunset and everything that happens in between. Martha's bedroom window faced east, toward the mountains where Samuel had died, and she'd kept the curtains drawn for months after his death, unable to bear the sight of those peaks that had claimed him. But now she pulled the fabric aside and looked out at the landscape that had shaped her life, the rolling hills and distant mountains that had seemed like the edge of the world when she and Samuel had first arrived here, full of dreams and determination. She sprinkled salt along the wooden sill, and as she did, she noticed things she'd been blind to in her grief. The way the late afternoon light painted the grass gold, the movement of cattle in the distance, the hawks circling high overhead, riding the thermals with an effortless grace that spoke of freedom and possibility. The world hadn't stopped when Samuel died, she realized. It had kept turning, kept offering its gifts, kept extending its invitations to participate in the great ongoing story of life itself. The fifth and final place Elena had mentioned was the bedroom threshold, the entrance to the most private, most intimate space in the home. This is where we are most ourselves, Elena had explained, where we rest, where we dream, where we are vulnerable. Salt there opens the door to healing sleep, to dreams that guide us, to the deep rest that lets us wake up renewed. Martha's bedroom had become a shrine to Samuel's memory, his clothes still hanging in the wardrobe, his side of the bed undisturbed, his personal effects arranged exactly as he'd left them. She'd been sleeping on the couch in the front room for months, unable to bear the intimacy of their shared space, the reminders of all the quiet moments they'd shared in the darkness before dawn, the whispered conversations and gentle laughter that had made their marriage a refuge from the harshness of frontier life. But now she stood in the bedroom doorway and scattered salt across the threshold, and as she did, she felt something shift in her understanding. This room wasn't just a museum of the past, it was a place where love had lived, where it had been nurtured and celebrated and expressed in countless small ways. The love itself wasn't gone even if Samuel was. It lived on in her, in the way he'd changed her, in the strength he'd given her, in the memories that could comfort rather than torment if she let them. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hand touching the quilt they'd shared, and for the first time in 3 years, the tears that came weren't born of despair but of gratitude. She'd been so focused on what she'd lost that she'd forgotten what she'd gained, forgotten that loving Samuel and being loved by him had been a gift that death couldn't erase. As evening settled over the homestead, Martha found herself moving through her cabin with a lightness she hadn't felt since before that terrible winter. The salt in each of the 5 places seemed to catch and hold the lamplight, creating small beacons of hope in the gathering darkness. She prepared dinner for herself with care, setting the table properly, eating slowly and mindfully instead of mechanically consuming whatever was easiest to prepare. The next morning brought visitors. Henderson arrived with fresh bread and news from town, her eyes showing surprise and pleasure at the warmth of Martha's welcome. "You look different," she said, settling into the chair across from Martha at the kitchen table, "like you've come back from somewhere far away." Martha smiled, pouring coffee for both of them, noticing how the salt on the table seemed to sparkle in the morning light. "I think maybe I have," she said. "I think maybe I've been lost for a while and I'm just now finding my way back." As the weeks passed, Martha found herself engaging with life in ways she'd forgotten were possible. She accepted an invitation to the church social, where she found herself laughing at stories shared by other widows, women who understood her journey because they'd walked similar paths. She began helping with the school when the teacher fell ill, discovering that she had a gift for working with children, for helping them see the wonder in learning. Young Tom Phillips, barely 19 and new to the territory, began stopping by regularly to help with the heavier chores around her homestead. He was earnest and hard-working, with dreams of establishing his own ranch someday, and Martha found herself becoming something like an older sister to him, sharing the wisdom she and Samuel had accumulated about surviving and thriving in this unforgiving land. "My grandmother used to say that salt draws out the poison," Tom remarked one afternoon as he helped Martha preserve meat for the coming winter. He'd noticed the small piles of salt she maintained in the 5 places Elena had taught her about, but he was too polite to ask directly about their purpose. Martha looked up from her work, considering his words. "I think she was right," she said finally. "I think it draws out all kinds of poison, bitterness, despair, the kind of loneliness that eats at your soul." "Your grandmother sounds like she was a wise woman. She was a healer," Tom said with pride. People came from 3 counties away when they needed help with ailments the regular doctor couldn't cure. She said healing wasn't just about fixing what was broken in the body, it was about fixing what was broken in the spirit too. Martha nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. The salt hadn't magically erased her grief or brought Samuel back to life, but it had helped her remember that grief and love could coexist, that honoring Samuel's memory didn't require her to stop living, that the doors of her heart could open again without betraying the love she'd shared with her husband. As winter approached again, Martha felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the instinctive fear that had gripped her every autumn since Samuel's death. But this year was different. She'd spent months rebuilding connections, nurturing relationships, allowing herself to be part of the community that surrounded her isolated homestead. When the snows came, she wouldn't be facing them alone. Miss Henderson had invited her to spend the worst weeks of winter at her place, where they could share resources and companionship through the hardest months. Tom had promised to check on her homestead regularly, keeping the pipes from freezing and the roof clear of snow that might cause it to collapse. The congregation at the little church had organized a rotation of visits and shared meals that would ensure none of their members faced the brutal Wyoming winter in complete isolation. Standing in her doorway one evening as the first snows began to fall, Martha touched the salt she'd sprinkled there months ago. Some of it had been scattered by wind and weather, but she'd refreshed it regularly, maintaining the ritual Elena had taught. Now she understood it wasn't really about the salt itself. It was about the intention, the willingness to believe that doors could open, that hope could return, that life could expand again even after it had contracted to its smallest, most essential form. The wind that had once carried only the scent of her sorrow now brought the smoke from her neighbors' chimneys, the sound of children playing in the distance, the promise of another spring beyond the coming winter. Martha had learned that salt wasn't magic, but the act of placing it with purpose, with hope, with faith in the possibility of healing, that was its own kind of magic. She thought of Samuel often, but now the memories brought warmth instead of ache. She could feel his approval in the wind, his encouragement in the way the morning light fell across their kitchen table, his love in the strength she'd found to rebuild her life without abandoning his memory. The doors Elena had spoken of, the doors of the heart, the doors of hope, the doors that led to tomorrow were all open now, welcoming in whatever came next. As she closed her cabin door against the swirling snow, Martha smiled at the thought that would have seemed impossible just months ago. She was actually looking forward to finding out what tomorrow would bring. The salt had done its work, not through supernatural intervention, but by marking 5 places in her home as sacred, as worthy of attention, as doorways back to the fullness of life itself. In a land where survival often depended on hardening your heart against loss and disappointment, Martha had learned that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was let your heart soften again, let it be vulnerable to hope and connection and the possibility that even in the hardest places, love could find a way to grow. The salt glittered in the lamplight, 5 small altars to the truth that healing was possible, that doors could open, that even in the wilderness of grief, there were pathways back to joy.